Hi, a few people who I've shown my work to can't believe you can actually make a pen. So I've made this video of me making one. Pens are actually a particularly fun project to do. They start out as a hardware kit, and you can use a number of different materials to make up the barrels. For this Magestic Pen kit from Penn State Industries, I'm using a stabilized maple burl to make the barrels out of. A burl is actually an abnormal growth you'll sometimes see on the side of a tree. When you cut one open, you can see that the grain has a pretty striking pattern to it, which looks really good when finished, but it doesn't add any strength to the wood itself. By impregnating it with a resin under pressure, you stabilize the wood, making it less prone to breaking while being machined. The first step is to cut the barrel blanks to length. The kit comes with brass tubes that can be placed down the center of the blank. The blank needs to be cut about 1/16 of an inch or so longer than the tubes to allow for trimming and squaring later on. In order to get the brass tubes down the center of the blank, a hole needs to be drilled. I could use my drill press, but I think using a drill chuck mounted on the lathe's tailstock is more accurate. The tape on the drill is just a primitive depth stop, so I can slow down near the end. This helps prevent breakage as the drill comes out of the other end of the blank. Next, the tubes are glued into the barrel blanks. I prefer using a two-part epoxy for this, as it gives me a longer working time than a CA glue does. After the glue is cured, it's time to trim and square up the barrel blanks. This is done with a special tool called a barrel trimmer. The long part of the trimmer keeps the cutting head square to the hole in the blank. You just trim it down until you reach the brass tube itself. You don't want to trim too far, because if you shorten the brass, you might interfere with the mechanism of the pen if it's not long enough. Here I'm mounting the barrel blanks on a mandrel so they can be mounted on the lathe and turned into shape. The large steel bearings act as a depth gauge, so you know how far down to take the material. Now it's finally time for turning. I start with a rough and gouge, rounding out the square blanks, and then working my way downwards towards the guides bearings. After a time, I'll usually stop to inspect the work, and here I've found a small void in the blank. I'm filling it with a CA glue to prevent it from creating any bigger problems if it tears out. Once close enough to the guide bearings, I'll switch to using a skew chisel. A skew chisel gives a finer cut, but it also cuts slower than a gouge. One thing about using a skew chisel is you can't start cutting right at the end of a piece. You'll wind up catching the edge of it and tearing out a chunk. So you start close to the edge, but then you have to come back in the other direction in order to even it all out. So you make passes back and forth. Sometimes I'll turn the skew sideways and use it as a scraper in order to get even cuts across the top of the blank. Now I just repeat that process on the other barrel blank, starting with the rough and gouge, getting it down close to the bearings, and then switching to a skew chisel to get it all nice and smooth. Now it's time to start sanding. I start with a 100 grit sandpaper and work my way all the way up through a 600 grit. The wood block that I'm using as a backer helps keep everything nice and flat. Now I'm applying the finish to the barrels. The finish I'm using is actually a CA glue, also known as crazy glue. A CA glue is acrylic based and it'll leave a hard acrylic shell on the wood. I'm actually using paper towels to apply it. You'd think that the paper towels would just stick to the wood after I put glue on them, but as long as the lathe is spinning, that doesn't happen. I'll put on about a dozen coats this way. After the finish is applied, it's time for a final sand and then a polish. I'm starting with a 600 grit wet sanding pad and working my way up through a 12,000 grit. Once sanding is complete, I'll use a polishing compound to give it a high gloss shine. Now that the barrels are complete, it's time to assemble the pen. I'll use my drill press with a wooden plunger mounted in the chuck to press fit all the parts together.